Black Dahlia. Episode 14. George Hodel. Part 2. The Black Dahlia Allegations. A complete study of the alleged crimes committed by George Hodel would easily be a separate series. This episode should be viewed as an introduction to the Hodel theory. For those intrigued, and wanting a deeper study, Steve Hodel has an ever-growing number of books and a website. For those not impressed and wanting alternative opinions, the Larry Harnish site might be of more interest. As always, I leave it up to you, the viewer, to come to your own conclusions. That said, let's get going. We'll have to hop and skip down the Hodel rabbit hole, focusing on the Black Dahlia murder and incidents potentially linked or closely linked to the murder. Much of the case against George Hodel has been presented by his son Steve, a retired LAPD homicide detective, who one day found a couple photos while going through his deceased father's belongings. These photos inspired him to start investigating the Black Dahlia murder, but we'll get to them later. Let's start long before that. Let's start in the past, when Steve was just a child, long before he ever thought of his father as a criminal mastermind and serial killer. George Hodel was on the suspect list of potential Black Dahlia killers, and his house was bugged as part of an investigation conducted by the DA's office. Those are facts. But just how strong was the case against him, and where did the allegations begin? The closest thing to a beginning of the suspicion of George Hodel being the murderer of Beth Short that I can see, would be the incest trial, where he was accused of sexually abusing his teenage daughter, Tamar, when she made a statement that her father had killed the Black Dahlia. But let's go back a little farther, to the suicide of his secretary, Ruth Spaulding, because some of the knowledge she took to her grave may have been related to other elements of the Black Dahlia investigation. Ruth Spaulding, age 27, former secretary working for George Hodel at his First Street Medical Clinic, overdosed on barbiturates on May 9, 1945. An unidentified person dropped her off at the Georgia Street Receiving Hospital, and she was pronounced dead at 11:45. The next day the Evening Herald Express printed, Ruth Spaulding, 25, of 1206 West 2nd Street, died last night in Georgia Street Receiving Hospital from an overdose of sleeping tablets, police said. On May 11, her death certificate listed her cause of death as barbital poisoning due to ingestion of lethal dose of barbiturates. Steve Hodel alleges that Spaulding and his father were having an affair and that he forced her to kill herself to cover up proof that Hodel was fabricating diagnoses so that he could charge patients for unnecessary medical services and prescriptions. On top of that, Hodel was supposedly performing illegal abortions, and Spaulding knew the details. Spaulding had already sent a bill to a one Mrs. X, in which Mrs. X became suspicious of a gonorrhea diagnosis. Mrs. X wrote a letter and gave instructions that it was not to be opened until after her death. The letter read as follows.
I, redacted, being of sound mind and memory, hereby testify and certify that I never had gonococcus infection, gonorrhea, despite the alleged findings of laboratory worker, redacted, who was employed by Dr. G. Hill Hodel, and that he said findings were true and correct and that Dr. Hodel guided himself by these erroneous reports. It is quite possible the said, redacted, falsified report, and then again it is probable he made an honest mistake. The above statement can be verified and proved by contacting, redacted. It is true I had and have, redacted, which was my only condition when I first called in Dr. Hodel and which was my only condition during the horrible period when I was told of the venereal disease I was alleged to have. The horrible time cost me dearly in nervous strain, mental anguish, and monetary expenditures. I make this statement so that in the event of my death, I am leaving an honest and true picture of the occurrence. When I arrived in, redacted, on March 9 and then learned that it was utterly impossible for me to have contracted in any form or manner such an infection, that this was definitely and satisfactorily proven to me, I wanted to take up the matter then and there with Dr. Hodel and staff. But because of the embarrassment involved and my still shaky condition, because of my natural reluctance to go through any more upheavals, I did not press the matter. If it weren't for my friend, redacted, Of Los Angeles I doubt if I could have so bravely faced the then alleged and supposed situation. He run to set my signature and verify and swear that all the above is true, redacted.
So, after requesting a second opinion from another doctor, Mrs. X was informed that she did not have gonorrhea. She requested further information from Hodell's clinic, and Ruth Spaulding provided a copy of the lab results confirming the negative results. So, what do you think, lab mix-up, or Hodell filling his pockets from fraudulent bills? Maybe Spaulding was just too honest to work for someone like Hodell. But would fraudulent billing be enough to commit murder? Would abortion? Did George Hodel perform abortions? The DA bugging transcripts mention a time and a woman was discussing a procedure called a correctment in the transcripts. This procedure is better known as a DNC procedure or dilation and curettage. This procedure is often used to perform an abortion. And Steve Hodel lists it as proof that his father was performing illegal abortions. All I will say is that George Hodel might have been performing illegal abortions. The DNC procedure can also be performed for a number of other reasons. Doctors can use a DNC to diagnose or as a treatment procedure for abnormal bleeding, including bleeding due to hormone imbalances, for removal of any remaining placenta after giving birth, or for determining the cause of abnormal or excessive uterine bleeding, to detect cancer and remove tumors and/or polyps, including uterine or cervical polyps, myomas, or polyps formed instead of normal pregnancy called a molar pregnancy, or to investigate reasons for infertility, or removing tissues remaining after miscarriage or abortion. So, George Hodel may have been performing what he called correctments for any number of reasons, not just abortions. And as we will see in the incest trial part, quotes that show Hodel was against abortions. Although suspicious activity that we will look at shows that Hodel deliberately covered up evidence pertaining to the Spaulding suicide. Basically, according to the theory, George Hodel gave Spaulding a lethal dose, called his wife Dorero to come to Spaulding's apartment, gave Dorero the written notes about the fabricated billings and abortions, and then ordered Dorero to burn the proof. Hodel then took Spaulding to the hospital and was the unidentified person who dropped her off. He also claimed that Spaulding would have known the patient files and recalled that Hodel had treated Beth Short for a venereal disease in 1945, and that after Short's murder, Spaulding could have volunteered that information to the police, or it would have come out in grand jury testimony had Spaulding been called to testify. The only problem with that is that Beth Short was not in Los Angeles in 1945. Her whereabouts were well documented. That leaves the part about Hodel ordering Dorero to burn Spaulding's papers. There would have to have been something truly incriminating for Hodel to have done that, at least the fraudulent billings, possibly illegal abortions. Either or would have gotten him in serious legal trouble. And one last thing to consider about the Spaulding incident, and he even mentions the Black Dahlia, from the bugging transcripts. February 18, 50 Hodel speaking to Baron Heringer. 7:35 p.m.
Supposin', I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead.
7:45 p.m. Hodel continues conversation with Baron Heringer.
Realized there was nothing I could do, put a pillow over her head, and cover her with a blanket. Get a taxi. Call Georgia Street Receiving Hospital right away. Expired at 12:39. They thought there was something fishy. Anyway, now they may have figured it out. Killed her. Maybe I did kill my secretary.
Some say Hodel knew his house was bugged and was just leading the investigators on. Others disagree. We'll look at more of the transcripts later, and I'll leave it up to you to come to your own conclusions. Summer, 1949, George Hodel's daughter, Tamar, from wife Dorothy Anthony Barb was sent to stay at her father's because she said Tamar had been a problem child for many years. Saying she was
uncontrollable and incorrigible, and it was time for her father to take over.
On October 1, 1949, Tamar ran away from the Sowden House. Police found her 3 days later at the home of friend, Sonia Biberman. She told investigators about sex parties at the Sowden House. Anyone wishing to go into full details will have to search for the accounts from other sources so that I can keep this as YouTube-friendly as possible. She then gave details as to being forced to join her father as well as Fred Sexton, Barbara Sherman, and Corinne, Connie, Taryn in said acts. And said her father had been being improper with her since she was 11. She also said her father had forced her to have an abortion. George Hodel was arrested on charges of incest, but posted a $5,000 bail on October 6, 1949, and was released. Also implicated were 13 teenage boys, classmates at Hollywood High School, who she accused of forcing her into improper acts. Finally, Dr. Francis C. Ballard and his associate, Charles Smith, were arrested for performing the alleged abortion. Police searched the home, seizing photographs and what were described as pornographic art objects. During the investigation, Hodel made a number of strange statements including,
"We were delving into the mystery of love and the universe. These acts of which I am accused are unclear, like a dream. I can't figure out if someone is hypnotizing me or I am hypnotizing someone. If I am really here, then these things must have happened."
Hodel hired famous defense attorney Jerry Geisler and his partner Robert A. Neeb for his defense. Tamar testified that the alleged incident happened on July 1, 1949, and said her father, Fred Sexton, Corinne Taryn, and Barbara Sherman were in her father's bedroom. Tamar drank a tumbler of sherry and then the group performed improper acts on her. Corinne Taryn testified that she had been present and witnessed the acts of others, but did not participate. Fred Sexton testified that he kissed Tamar, but did not complete any improper acts. Barbara Sherman changed earlier testimony given during a previous hearing and now denied witnessing and/or participating in anything improper. Of course, George Hodel denied the accusations as well. It was during cross-examination that the Black Dahlia was mentioned. Neeb asked her if she recalled a conversation with another Sowden House resident, Joe Barrett, in which she supposedly said,
"This house has secret passages. My father is the murderer of the Black Dahlia. My father is going to kill me and all the rest of the members of this household because he has a lust for blood. He is insane."
Tamar responded later that she did not remember saying that. The following day, the press tore into Tamar's testimony with statements like,
"Girl accused of trying to pin Dahlia murder on dad. Girl's story is fantasy, court hears. Neeb hammered at the fantasies of blonde Tamar Hodel. The 14-year-old daughter of a prominent Hollywood physician, plotted his downfall with fantastic stories, including one that he killed Elizabeth, Black Dahlia, Short, his attorney, Robert A. Neeb Jr., sought to prove today."
Tamar's mother testified, giving negative statements including,
"A San Francisco psychiatrist had labeled the child as a pathological liar. That the child was given to the telling of fantastic tales, which had little or no basis in fact. Much of her abnormal behavior has to do with stories and statements about sex."
Tamar's grandmother and even classmates from San Francisco testified against her, agreeing with the mother's statements. The future abortion trial received a blow against Tamar's case weeks in advance of the trial date. Stepbrother Duncan Hodel testified that Tamar had admitted to him that she was pregnant and that she wanted an abortion, but she said her father denied her request.
"Because he's death on abortions. Father wants me to be saddled with a damned brat the rest of my life, and me only 14. If I'm not allowed to do what I want, I'll get even with that. I'm going to say that on a certain night I had sex relations with my father. I know it isn't true, but the cops won't."
She also reportedly told the housekeeper,
"If George is incurably sick and in pain, will you give him something to put him out of his misery like a mercy killing?"
Tamar later denied ever having said any of these statements. When it was finally Hodell's turn on the witness stand, he claimed that he had been doing a hypnotism demonstration and things got out of hand. Tamar had removed her blouse and bra, and Sexton was atop her, but fully clothed. At that point Hodell claimed to have pulled Sexton off Tamar and kicked him out of the room along with Corinne Tarrin. He then sent Tamar to her room. He also brought up that he may have recently suffered a heart attack, or perhaps that's what he was calling his angina attacks, which he had disclosed in his UNRRA application. In the end, Hodell was acquitted. Only Barbara Sherman received probation for contributing to the delinquency of a minor. The January 1950 abortion trial ended with a slap on the wrist for Ballard and Smith. Felony abortion charges were dropped and the defendants pleaded guilty to contributing to the delinquency of a minor. On Steve Hodell's website he reproduces a copy of the plea agreement. It's quite lengthy, so I'll leave a link below. But in the plea agreement, it is stated that Hodell did attempt to perform an abortion on Tamar by injecting her with ergot. Excerpt from plea agreement.
Tamar Hodel further testified that during the time she was complaining to her father about her pregnancy her father gave her 3 shots of ergot, which is an abortive agent. Tamar Hodel claims she did not abort prior to the incident in Dr. Ballard's office on September 11.
However, the plea agreement also stated,
there is absolutely no physical evidence in support of Tamar Hodel's testimony that an abortion was performed upon her by Dr. Ballard, this due to the lapse of time between September 11 and the matter coming to the attention of the authorities at some later date.
And
for the reason that in the previous trial wherein Tamar Hodel testified regarding incestuous relationship with her father and that in that trial the credibility of Tamar Hodel was carefully explored by the defense, and that it appears her credibility is to be considerably questioned, and for the reason that there is no physical evidence or additional evidence to support her claim that she was actually aborted by Dr. Ballard, and for the reason that Dr. Ballard does not admit that he actually aborted Tamar Hodel, it is believed that a conviction on the offense of abortion would be difficult to obtain.
One strange incident surrounding the incest trail was that Charles Smith, who had been charged with performing an illegal abortion along with Dr. Ballard, and as already stated both got off with a plea bargain deal that dropped their charges to contributing to the delinquency of a minor, made a bizarre statement as related in a memo to DA's office investigator Lieutenant Frank B. Jemison from investigator Walter Morgan.
Smith said that someday he was going to fix Tamar. He was going to cut a chunk out of the calf of her leg and fry it and eat it in front of her eyes, and then puke it up in front of her face.
Now, let's go off on a side rabbit hole of speculation that will go into the future and then veer back into the past. Tamar met and befriended Michelle Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas fame. And Phillips adds a unique account of George Hodel and a plausible reason why Tamar's mother, grandmother, and other family members may have taken Hodel's side of things. And then I will present that George would have had the funds to do just that. And incidentally, Michelle Phillips is no stranger to incest. Her stepdaughter Mackenzie Phillips, whose mother Susan Adams Phillips was the first wife of John Phillips, Michelle being his second wife, had a 10-year-long incestuous relationship with John Phillips. In 1967, Tamar visited Michelle Phillips, who was in San Francisco for a performance with the Mamas and the Papas. She took along George, who was visiting from the Philippines. Incidentally, George had 2 Asian girlfriends with him at the time. When Tamar introduced them, Michelle later said of the meeting,
I felt a chill, and a lot of it was because I knew that he knew that she had told me. And I recently started thinking about the way he looked at me. I think he wanted to kill me.
Michelle Phillips added why she thought Tamar's relatives did not stick up for Tamar at the trial.
No one wanted George Hodel to go to jail, because George Hodel was the one making all the money, and he was supporting all the people surrounding this tale.
Just speculating, but if George Hodel was paying off his relatives, he may have been doing so for Tamar's child, Fauna, who was adopted into a poor black family even though she was white. Someone brokered a deal so that this child would be adopted into a poor family. Someone approached Fauna's adoptive family with a deal. I found this interesting bit on the website refinery29.com.
Hodel controlled nearly every aspect of his teenage daughter's pregnancy. He named Tamar's baby Fauna, taken from the same poem from which he got the name Tamar, and insisted she be put up for adoption. Allegedly, George even brokered the terms of the adoption with Jimmy Lee, a casino worker, himself. Tamar's only act of assertion was insisting the baby's father was black. According to Fauna Hodel's website, Tamar did this to ensure that the child would never return to her emotionally reclusive white family.
Fauna believed that in periods of her life she was being followed by spies for George Hodel and that her phone was being tapped. I guess he would want to keep an eye on his investment. Even though Hodel must have had financial problems in the late 40s, thus prompting him to bring in boarders to the Sowden House, in later years he would find himself wealthy, or at least comfortable, with his business venture in marketing research, UNRRA Asia, which included market research for such firms as Boeing, the World Tourism Organization, major airlines, and hotel chains. And later, his other business venture in real estate, the Land Growth Corporation, would have netted him more profits. Both ventures would have been extremely lucrative during the Japanese business peak of the 1970s and 1980s, which would have given him more than enough funds to keep an eye on his children and grandchildren, but also provided for a more than comfortable retirement. The website, factsanddetails.com, details the Asian, especially Japanese, business boom of this time.
By the 1980s, Japan had built up such huge trade surpluses, and the yen had become so strong, that Japanese businessmen were buying up properties all over the world, and Japanese tourists were fanning out to every corner of the globe. Many people thought Japan was poised to dominate the world economically, and Japan bashing became a popular conversation topic in the United States and elsewhere.
And
the 1980s was when the Japan as number one syndrome emerged. As the U.S. was economically struggling, it was looked upon with scorn, in fact contempt, as was vividly illustrated by the publication of the hubristic book, The Japan That Can Say No, co-authored by Sony co-founder and chairman Akio Morita, and leading political figure Shintaro Ishihara, who was also known for staunchly denying that the 1937 Nanjing massacre had occurred.
And proof that George Hodel was on top of Japanese real estate growth is on the ad for his Land Growth real estate business advertisement.
Land values are rising very fast in some Asian and Pacific areas. In Japan, real estate prices have multiplied 15 times in 15 years. Out of the top 100 income earners in Japan, 92 made their profits from land sales. Property values are also rising rapidly in other countries.
George Hodel had the pulse of Asian business growth on his fingertips, especially Japanese real estate expansion, and milked that pulse into a lucrative investment that would have steadily grown through the late 50s, into the 60s, and exploded into the boom of the 70s and 80s. Even if he had financial problems in the 40s, he was filling his pockets in later years. Interestingly, the Japanese boom ended about the same time as Hodel's retirement. From the Los Angeles Times, February 21, 1992.
The Leventhal study estimates Japanese investment in U.S. real estate last year at $5.6 billion, down from the $13.6 billion spent in 1990. The peak year for Japanese investing was 1988 when they spent $16.54 billion on U.S. properties. The drying up of Japanese real estate money in California was even more dramatic. Total investment tumbled 83% to $976 million, a trend the study attributes to the state's steep recession. For the first time in 4 years, Hawaii attracted more Japanese real estate money than California. Los Angeles was eclipsed by both New York and Honolulu as the city of choice for Japanese real estate funds.
So, George Hodel would have had more than enough funds to control the adoption and adoptive family life of his granddaughter, Fauna. Soon after the trial, there was trouble at the Sowden House. In January 1950, police were called to the Hodel residence in response to a possibly suicidal woman. The woman, Lillian Lenorak, had testified in the Hodel incest trial. She was living at the Sowden House at the time of the alleged incident and after the trial. Lillian had testified for the defense at the incest trial and was contemplating recanting her testimony and admitting she had perjured herself by not saying at the trial that she had been present along with Charles Smith during Dr. Ballard's examination of Tamar. Lenorak's mother, a Mrs. Hamilton, asked Santa Barbara authorities to retrieve her daughter and return her. In a strange, almost unbelievable, turn of events, the female officer sent by Santa Barbara police was none other than Mary Unkefer, the same officer who had taken in Beth Short as a temporary ward after her arrest for underage drinking in 1943. Following is Mary Unkefer's description of events in a letter to the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office.
January 30th, 50. District Attorney's Office, 209, West Valerio Street. Los Angeles, California, Santa Barbara, California. Dear Sir, I am sorry, I missed the gentleman from your office on Wednesday. I work at odd hours and I arrived at home about 10 minutes after your man left for work Los Angeles. I had expected to come to Los Angeles early this week as I had business to attend to there, but find it is not necessary for me to make the trip except to give you what information I can regarding the woman whom I brought to Santa Barbara from the home of Dr. Hodel on Franklin Avenue. Mrs. Hamilton, mother of the young woman, asked me to go to Los Angeles to get her and her baby. I called Dr. Hodel before I left Santa Barbara to make sure the patient was at his home and there would be no chance of me running into a snag when I got there as it was night and I was not prepared to have to look for her. Dr. Hodel told me that it was very necessary for her to be removed from his home that same evening as he intended to put her in an institution in Los Angeles if she was not immediately taken back to Santa Barbara. He informed me that 2 of her friends were there and that they would return to Santa Barbara with Lillian to keep her from becoming too much of a problem on the way. When I arrived at the Franklin address, I took a young woman with me. I sensed something wrong as soon as I entered the building. The doctor seemed very anxious to tell me that the girl was in a bad mental condition and that she had attempted suicide. I asked where the parties were who were going to ride to Santa Barbara with me and he said he could not get in touch with them at that time. But when I assured him that I would not take the girl with me unless her friends would go along, he then called the woman, Karan Tatikian, who came to his home and said she would go with me. 2 young men volunteered to drive another car and follow me to see that I got the girl safely home. Joseph Barrett, who lives at the same address on Franklin, and another young man friend who was not interested in the case, except that he offered to drive Barrett up here and then take the woman and the other man, Joe Barrett, back to Los Angeles. When I asked to see Lillian, Dr. Hodel explained that I had no need to worry about her giving me trouble on the way to Santa Barbara. He stated that he had given her a large enough dose to keep her asleep for 3 hours. With the aid of the Mexican maid, who looks like a half-wit or a hophead, we packed Lillian's clothes and it was about 10 p.m. before we got away from his home. Dr. Hodel and Joe Barrett took Lillian to my car, holding her up on both arms. That wakened her, and she began to tell us about the doctor. She talked a great deal about her relations with him and she stated that she was very much afraid of him. She said she had witnessed an abortion performed on his own little girl and then she stated that he had threatened to have her child taken from her if she did not testify in his favor in court. She said he knew of some of her foolishness in connection with a man called Charles, and that he, the doctor, was holding that over her. She said that she had never attempted suicide and that she had never cut her wrists or her hands. She stated that the doctor constantly gave her drugs and that when she wakened the cutting had been done. While I was in the doctor's sitting room waiting for the woman who was to drive with us, I asked the doctor what had caused the girl to go haywire so suddenly. He said it was a great deal to do with some case she had in court. It was not until Lillian wakened and told us how she had perjured herself in court for the doctor that I realized what case it was that had caused her so much worry. There were scratches and bruises on her forehead and arms. Her 3-year-old baby said the doctor knocked his mommy down and made mommy cry hard. On the way north, the car with the young men in drove behind us and it was after I left Lillian at the FICO ward at the General Hospital that I had a chance to talk to Joe Barrett. He stated emphatically that there was nothing wrong with Lillian except what had been brought on by the cruel treatment received from Dr. Hodel. He stated that he knew Lillian had perjured herself at the trial because the doctor had her under his influence. He stated that the relations between the doctor and his child were terrible and were worse than I had any idea. He stated that the doctor boasted that the $15,000 he paid Jerry Geisler was used to influence the district attorney, and that was how the doctor was cleared of the charge against him. He stated that Lillian had fallen in love with Charles and that Charles was an assistant to another doctor, a friend of Hodel. When I asked Barrett where this Charles was now living, he stated that he had taken off after the doctor's trial and was in San Francisco. Lillian stated that she had a very guilty mind after the trial and told Hodel that she was going to tell the district attorney that she had lied on the witness stand, and that Dr. Hodel told her if she squealed that he would name Charles and the other doctor as being the ones who performed the operation. Joe Barrett spoke of Dr. Hodel as being a real and good guy. I visited Lillian at the hospital on Sunday, yesterday. She seemed glad to see me and stated that she would like to tell me all about the true facts concerning the doctor's activities and the trial, but she stated she knew he would have her done away with as well as her baby. She said she would like to have told the men from your office all about it, but she said she was not sure if you were her friends, and she was just plumb scared to tell for fear he would carry out his threat to have her boy taken from her and to have her committed to an insane institution. This morning, I went to the hearing at the FICO ward and it was determined that she is mentally upset. The doctor said a deal of the condition was brought about from the strain of the trial. Both doctors stated that they felt she should have medical care. So she is to be taken to Camarillo State Hospital for treatment. My personal opinion is that if the feeling between her and her mother was not so strained, she might have been given a chance to go home and be taken care of by her mother. There seems to have never been love between those two. The mother takes the attitude that she is going to make Lillian do things the way she, mother, wants them, and the girl seems just as determined that she is not going to be always treated as a child. Hence, there is fireworks between them. Joe Barrett and Karan Tatikian were here from Los Angeles to attend the hearing. Joe has had a good chance to talk to Dr. Hodel, and he knows the district attorney's office is interested in the case. He seems to be afraid he might be questioned about the trial because his whole attitude was changed. He now speaks of the doctor as not a bad fellow, with plenty of worries of his own. He spoke and acted as though he is sorry he opened his mouth the night I brought Lillian home from Los Angeles. Karan Tatikian's address is 2211 South Highland. Dancing teacher. I do not know that this information will be of any help to you. It is about all I could tell you if I came down personally. But if there is anything I can do to help in anything that is good and sincere, I am at your service. Very sincerely yours, Mary H. Unkefer.
A Sergeant Bill Bentley also wrote a letter about the incident.
Lieutenant Walter Sullivan, 24, February 50. I got a phone call from our friend, Mrs. Hamilton, Lenorak's mother. She just wanted to let me know that Jack Usher has been bothering her by phone. Jack wants to know where Lillian Lenorak is. Usher stated that Dr. Hodel had called him and told Usher that Karam, dancer, had just told Hodel some of the things that Lillian had said about Hodel at the lunacy hearing, and Hodel wanted Usher to find out more about it. Usher made this call on February 22, 1950. Hamilton also said that immediately after she arrived home from the lunacy hearing, Jack Usher phoned her and wanted to know about the hearing. Hamilton felt that someone at the hearing contacted him. Also, Hamilton stated Joe and Karam completely denied promising anything in way of contracts etc. to Lenorak. Joe and Karam also completely exonerated the doctor at the hearing. Also, Hamilton stated that Lenorak at the hearing stated she was afraid to run away from the place because Hodel threatened to do away with the boy if she left. Walt, you may already have all this information, but nevertheless here it is for what it is worth. Sorry to have missed you. I had to come down for a GT trial in Municipal Court Division 12. Judge Adams. Quite a girl. Anything else you need, just whistle. Sergeant Bill Bentley.
Although it states some witnesses described exonerated Hodell, what is truly interesting is the statement that
Also, Hamilton stated that Lenorak at the hearing stated she was afraid to run away from the place because Hodell threatened to do away with the boy if she left.
none of this really implicates Hodell as having anything to do with the Black Dahlia murder, although, according to Steve Hodel, Lillian Lenorak identified a picture of Beth Short as being one of George Hodell's girlfriends. That said, George Hodell's name did turn up on the official district attorney's suspect list. And he was under suspicion of murder, and the go-ahead was given to bug the Sowden House, as said in the following investigator's progress report as found in Black Dahlia Avenger 2, page 133.
Investigators' Progress Report. Case number 30-1268 date, 2/27/50. Title, Short, Elizabeth. Suspects, Dr. George Hill, investigator assigned Jemison. Charge, murder. This case is, active brief statement AS2 results to date, indicate present status if being brought to trial at this time. On February 15, 1950, the undersigned investigator, working with Sergeant Stanton and Guineas from the LAPD Crime Lab, installed 2 microphones in the home of Dr. George Hodel. The microphones were connected to a wire recorder located in the basement of the Hollywood station of the LAPD through telephone lines leased from the Pacific Telephone and Telegram Company. Trouble was not rectified until approximately 2 o'clock, February 18. No intelligible conversation was heard over the system until that time. Signed, David E. Bronson.
Some of the most damning statements from the bugging are the following. 2:18:50 Hodel speaking to Baron Herringer. 7:35 p.m.
Supposin', I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead.
7:45 p.m. Hodel continues conversation with Baron Herringer.
Realized there was nothing I could do, put a pillow over her head, and cover her with a blanket. Get a taxi. Call Georgia Street Receiving Hospital right away. Expired at 12:39. They thought there was something fishy. Anyway, now they may have figured it out. Killed her. Maybe I did kill my secretary.
Some researchers believe George Hodel knew he was being bugged. Whatever you think on the matter, Hodel threw a lot of words into the transcript that would have cast doubt on even some of the most incriminating statements. For instance, supposin' I did kill the Black Dahlia, and maybe I did kill my secretary. One interesting part of the bugging transcript involves a woman screaming. 8:20 p.m. Sounded as though the 2 men went down steps and entered the basement and began digging. Something was referred to, not a trace. It also appeared as though a pipe was being hit. 8:25 p.m. Woman screamed. 8:27 p.m. Woman screamed again. It should be noted that a woman was not heard before the time of screaming since 6:50 p.m. She was not in any conversation, and not heard again until the time of letting out these 2 screams. If you believe Hodel knew he was being bugged and just playing games with police, then this would show that the police knew that Hodel knew and thus did not enter the house. If Hodel did not know he was being bugged, then he and another man, a Baron Herringer, may have killed or seriously hurt a woman. The only reason why the police wouldn't have intervened that I can think of is that they knew Hodel was playing games. For those wishing to study the complete bugging transcripts, Steve Hodel published the transcripts in Black Dahlia Avenger 2. Otherwise, Larry Harnish has copies of the transcripts on his website. I'll put a link below. A boarder at the Sowden House, Joe Barrett, worked as an informant for DA investigator Frank Jemison. Barrett produced photos of Hodel nude with a woman who would later be identified as singer-actress Mattie Comfort. On Steve Hodel's website, he shows a brief clip from the DA investigation transcripts. The transcript included. She said that she was with Dr. Hodel sometime prior to the murder and that she knew about his being associated with victim. Either at the time of the transcript being compiled or at a later date, someone added the word nothing between knew and about. So Mattie Comfort had either claimed that Hodel knew Beth or knew nothing about her. Years later, Steve Hodel would be contacted by Mattie Comfort's boyfriend, George Parkington, after Mattie's death in 2003. Parkington told Steve this about George Hodel and the Black Dahlia.
"Here's what I will tell you. Mattie told me that she and everybody else were sure that it was your father that killed the Black Dahlia. They had no doubt. She told me, we all knew that he had done it. Now, who the we was I'm not sure, but there are some people still around from way back then. I'll try and dig on that a little bit and see if there is someone you can speak with. Most of the people I know were more like from the 50s, so I'm not sure there is anybody I can locate from that exact era."
Steve Hodel also lists a one Jack Egger as a witness claiming to have seen Beth with man he identified as George Hodel. According to Steve Hodel in Black Dahlia Avenger 2, Egger was a DA office investigator who later became a detective in the Beverly Hills Police Department and finally chief of security for Warner Brothers Studio. But at the time of his sighting, Egger was chief usher for the CBS studio in Hollywood. He claimed that in early January 1947, he saw Beth Short in the patio area of CBS studio, waiting to attend the Jack Carson radio show. A man with Beth identified himself as a Chicago police officer. In 2004, Steve Hodel showed Egger a photo of George Hodel, and Egger positively identified him as the man he had seen with Beth. Egger also claimed that Beth was a regular Carson attendee, claiming to have seen her at the show at least 20 times, but she had always attended alone. On the Black Dahlia in Hollywood website, there is a bit about Egger identifying Patrick S. O'Reilly as the man with Beth, but he later changed his mind when he saw O'Reilly in person. Just how certain could Egger's identification of Hodel be so many decades later? Hodel and O'Reilly don't even look alike. Another thing to take into consideration is that Beth was in San Diego at the time, staying with the Frenches. While it's not impossible for someone to drive from San Diego to Hollywood and then back to San Diego, Hodel would have to have driven to San Diego, picked up Beth, drove her back to CBS studios in Hollywood, watched the Jack Carson radio show live. The show ran from 6:30 to 7, then driven her back to San Diego, and then would have to have driven himself back home, unless he stayed somewhere for the night in San Diego. A lot of work for a date. It just seems like a stretch, unless they met at the show. It would be more plausible that Beth got a ride from someone in San Diego and then went back after the show. But that even seems like a stretch. It's far more likely that Egger got the date wrong. The Chicago police angle also comes up when researchers try to tie the Black Dahlia murder in with the Chicago lipstick murders of Josephine Ross, Frances Brown, and Suzanne Dignan. Most notably in relation to Beth, Susan Dignan. Dignan was a 6-year-old victim, abducted from her home in the middle of the night, strangled, dismembered, and found in the sewers later. They found her head, then torso, and then legs, all in different areas of the sewer or stuck in sewer drains or catch basins. They found her arms several weeks later. Hodel's basic theory tying the Dignan and Short murders is that Dignan's arms were found on Hollywood Avenue, and Beth Short's body was discovered near Dignan Boulevard. Steve Hodel believes Beth was investigating the case, traveling to Chicago on her own, even sleeping with reporters to get information. Here is an excerpt of a letter to DA investigator Jemison where he discusses this. This excerpt is from Most Evil by Steve Hodel, page 51.
R301248 Lieutenant Frank B. Jemison, February 20, 51. Elizabeth Short murder. Page 4. 8. Unknown Chicago police officer. Further that the following named persons knew victim while she was in Chicago en route to Long Beach, California in July 1946. Jack Chernow, residence, 7107 Grand Avenue, Chicago. He registered at the Blackstone Hotel with Short and saw her approximately 15 times in 3 weeks. He had intercourse with her. He was in the upholstery business. Slig Diamond, a newspaperman whose residence is Park Row Hotel, Chicago. he saw Short over a 10-day period and has stated that he had intercourse with her and says that she was always talking about murder cases. Lou Paris, feature writer for the Chicago Daily Times, Chicago, knew Short and talked with her, at which time she was keenly interested in the famous Aaron's Chicago murder case. John Jampa, 3421 West Lexington, was a mailer for Chicago Herald-American. He knew her and said that Short knew a Chicago detective who worked on the Aaron's case. Jan Jansen, a reporter on the Chicago Daily News, has stated that he knew victim in Chicago. All of these named persons knew Short in the month of July, 1946, approximately 6 months before the murder, and any one of these men could have had honorary Special Chicago Police badges.
This is an excerpt. The full document can be read in Childhood Shadows, Mary Pacios, on pages 364 through 366. This is a strange series of events. I'll leave it up to you to come to your own conclusions. But so much of this seems out of character. Had I not found a complete letter in Mary Pacios's book, I might have dismissed this, as this is getting to be a much longer than normal episode. The first thing I find odd is that 2 of these people claim to have had sex with Beth in a short period of time, way out of character. Another odd thing is Beth suddenly turning into Nancy Drew, and associating with reporters, even sleeping with one, as well as possibly knowing a cop who worked the case. No one who knew her ever said she had any interest in murder cases or crime in general. The Lipstick Murders case, which included the Dignan murder, and the case against Aarons, would have been well known. I could see it coming up as a topic of conversation. But here we have witnesses saying she was not just interested in the Aarons case, but always talking about murder cases. I guess you'll have to make of it what you will. A large part of the Hodel theory involves the missing week and the possibility that Beth was forced to eat feces and granular material. I have already discussed these topics in other videos, so there is no reason to go into it again here. But until I see anything definitive, I do tend to agree that witnesses did see Beth during the missing week. And I also find feces present in her stomach as odd, and I believe the granular material in her stomach was most likely fertilizer, most likely granular fertilizer. And I did look into that because of material on Steve Hodel's website in which he thought bags seen in crime scene photos may have been Bandini fertilizer sacks. Anyone interested who hasn't already seen the videos can find them in the episode list. Another major part of the Hodel theory is that the same person who killed Beth committed other murders around the Los Angeles area. Of course, Steve Hodel alleges that his father is the murderer. And this was also a large part of the grand jury investigation. This will be looked at in a future episode about the werewolf murders. One of the major arguments that Steve Hodel makes that his father murdered Beth is handwriting analysis. He first noticed the similarities while looking at what he was listed as Exhibit 18 in Black Dahlia Avenger. First, he noticed that it was written with a ballpoint pen, which I have already pointed out in other episodes was very expensive in 1947, and second, he also made a statement that he could unequivocally identify the writing as his father's. He then saw similarities in the message written on the victim Jean French. Fuck you BD, or many people say PD. We will look into her in more detail in the werewolf killer episode. For this episode we will only look at the writing. He consulted with handwriting expert Hannah McFarland, sending her copies of selected Avenger communications and known samples of George Hodel's handwriting. McFarland gave her opinion that it was highly probable that the message written on Jean French's book was written by the same person who wrote at least 4 of the Avenger communications. McFarland explained her highly probable classification.
Absent the examination of the actual original documents, due to having to work with photocopies and scans, which would allow for the possibility of cut and paste, and alterations, it is standard practice that a positive opinion cannot be given.
But that highly probable classification meant she was
virtually certain that the questioned and known writings were written by the same person.
However, she said that classification was dependent on assurance of the accuracy of the copies, that they were not altered, cross-scanned, or tampered with. An expert, John Osborn, hired by CBS for their 48 Hours Black Dahlia Confidential special, had a differing opinion to McFarlane's.
There is simply not enough evidence to prove one way or another whether his father was the writer or not the writer.
Chapter 8 in Black Dahlia Avenger goes into complete detail about the handwriting analysis. Make up your own minds. The original inspiration for Steve Hodel to begin his investigation into the Black Dahlia murder and his father as his own personal prime suspect came after George Hodel's death in 1999. When going through his father's things, he found a small photo album. Inside, he found photos of two women. At the time they were both unidentified, and Steve believed they were of the same woman. Many people, including myself, were not impressed with the photos. And so it turned out that the first of the photos was definitely not Elizabeth Short. A woman came forward and identified herself as Maria Marco, also known as Mary Marco, also known as Maria San Marco, an actress. I can see that the first photo could have jogged someone's memory when you compare it to known photos of Beth. But I never saw any actual resemblance of her. That said, it could have inspired someone to jump to conclusions. The second photo is a bone of contention. Some say it is, and some say it is not Elizabeth Short. I think there is some resemblance in certain areas, but is not her. For instance, the height of the forehead, hairline, this is different. Larry Harnish states that Beth's family says it is not her. I guess it is yet another aspect of the Hodel theory that each individual viewer needs to come to their own conclusions with. The word hemicorporectomy comes up a lot in the Hodel theory, where Steve Hodel claims it was a medical procedure taught in the 1930s. However, the hemicorporectomy as a surgical procedure was not even theorized until 1950. Here is an excerpt from a scientific paper on the procedure by Dr. Bernard E. Ferrara M.D. Hemicorporectomy or translumbar amputation has been described as the most revolutionary of all operative procedures. Frederick E. Krettel, who first voiced the concept of the operation in 1950, referred to it as halfectomy. Demonstration of his cadaver studies established the feasibility of the operation. Amputation is effected through the lower lumbar area of the body. Necessary life functions are preserved in the upper torso. Another scientific paper by J. B. Ost, C.P. Page states, translumbar amputation, hemicorporectomy, was first successfully performed in 1961 after cadaver feasibility dissections. After cadaver feasibility studies. Both papers cite such feasibility studies. Feasibility studies that were not done until after the theoretical concept of the hemicorporectomy, which did not happen until 1950. I can find no references in studies of gross anatomy or basic dissection referencing the hemicorporectomy or other terms such as translumbar amputation prior to its theoretical implementation as surgical procedure in 1950. If it was a common procedure taught in medical schools in the 1930s, as Steve Hodel suggests, even as a method of studying gross anatomy, then a medical professional should be willing to give his name and credentials to go on record to prove it. There should be some reference in medical literature to such a so-called common procedure, it should be readily referenceable. Just as I hope that medical experts will go on record to describe how feces could be in Beth's stomach, as Larry Harnish said nameless experts told him was a part of normal digestion, I hope the nameless experts who told Steve Hodel that hemicorporectomies were taught in medical schools in the 1930s will come forward. Lieutenant Jemison, in his final report to the 1949 grand jury, said,
Dr. George Hodel, MD 5121 Fountain, Franklin Avenue, at the time of this murder had a clinic at East 1st Street near Alameda. Lillian Lenorak, who lived with this doctor, said he spent some time around the Biltmore Hotel and identified the photo of victim Short as a photo of one of the doctor's girlfriends. Tamar Hodel, 15-year-old daughter, stated that her mother, Dorothy Hodel, has told her that her father had been out all night on a party the night of the murder and said, "They'll never be able to prove I did that murder." 2 microphones were placed in the suspect's home, see the log and recordings made over approximately 3 weeks' time which tend to prove his innocence. See Statement of Dorothy Hodel, former wife. Informant Lillian Lenorak has been committed to the state mental institution at Camarillo. Joe Barrett, a roomer at the Hodel residence, cooperated as an informant. A photograph of the suspect in the nude with a nude identified colored model was secured from his personal effects. Undersigned identified this model as Mattie Comfort, 3423 Andolph South Arlington, Republic 4953. She said that she was with Dr. Hodel sometime prior to the murder, and that she knew nothing about his being associated with the victim. Rudolph Walthers, known to have been acquainted with victim and also with suspect Hodel, claimed he had not seen victim in the presence of Hodel, and did not believe that the doctor had ever met the victim. The following acquaintances of Hodel were questioned and none were able to connect the suspect with murder: Fred Sexton, 1020 White Knoll Drive; Nita Maladero, 1617½ North Normandy; Ellen Taylor, 5121 Fountain Avenue; Finley Thomas, 616½ South Normandy; Mildred B. Colby, 4029 Vista del Monte Street, Sherman Oaks. This witness was a girlfriend of Charles Smith, abortionist friend of Hodel. Turin Gilkey, 1025 North Wilcox; Irene Somerset, 1236½ North Edgemont, Norman. Beckett, 1025 North Wilcox; Ethel Kane, 1033 North Wilcox; Annette Chase, 1039 North Wilcox; Dorothy Royer, 1636 North Beverly Glen. See supplemental reports, long sheets and hear recordings, all of which tend to eliminate this suspect.
Just a couple last things to ponder. An architect, Steve Lamb, was studying the Sowden House when an old man approached him, saying,
"It's an evil place. Artists, philosophers, accountants and politicians, we all played and paid there. Women were tortured for sport there. Murders happened there. It's an evil place."
The man turned out to be Edmund Teskey, a famous photographer, who was an acquaintance of George Hodel and knew Man Ray, and who, like Man Ray, took photos of the Sowden House and even Hodel family members. And just something interesting I found: an ancient form of Chinese execution known as the waist chop. This obviously could not have been how Elizabeth Short was bisected. Such a crude chopping instrument would never be seen as a fine piece of surgery, but someone who knew about such things could have been inspired by the technique. Of the known suspects, George Hodel would probably be the most likely candidate to know about the waist chop due to his time in China and fascination with Chinese culture. There is a lot to think about with all the research Steve Hodel has put into his investigation. But so much of this theory is based on circumstantial evidence. There may be a gun, but in my opinion, it's not a smoking gun. But I'll leave it up to you, the viewer, to come up with your own conclusions. I will quickly add a couple of interesting things. In July of 2018, Steve Hodel received an email from a woman going through her grandfather's belongings after his death. She found a letter he had written in 1949. Her grandfather, a 1W Glenn Martin, mentioned someone with the initials GH. He says he and this GH knew murder victim Louise Springer, and the Black Dahlia is mentioned. He states, "I believe Choate framed this with Macaulay to let GH get out of it, or Black Dahlia killer." The letter is in Black Dahlia Avenger 3, or online at the link in the sources below, should anyone wish to look into it. And Larry Harnish has a different opinion than Steve Hodel, link below. Make of it what you will. A human remains detection dog, Buster, possibly detected the smell of human remains on or near the Sowden House. Forensic anthropologist, Dr. Arpad Vass, thinks the best location for possible human remains to be found on property located behind the Sowden House. Property owners denied a request to allow Buster to sniff the property. Once again, Larry Harnish has another opinion than Steve Hodel, link below. Make of it what you will. Next time, in part 3 of the George Hodel theory, we will look at the exquisite corpse theory.